Audrey and I used to have different ideas about what it meant to be on time. I have since learned that my idea was wrong. See, before we were married, when we were engaged, I'd say, I'll come pick you up at 7. And Audrey would be ready promptly at 7, not show up 10 after or even a little later. And it was only after we'd been married for a while that I discovered I had been late every time that I had gone to pick up my fiancée for an evening. You see, in my mind, if I said 7 and I got there by 7:15, well, that's close enough to 7. It's closer to 7 than 7:30. But in Audrey's mind, 7 was 7 o'clock sharp. Well, I have since learned the error of my ways. Sometimes being late is the same as absolute failure. Even if we've completed 90% of a project, but it required 100% to be ready, it's a failure. I used to have a hard deadline every week as a pastor. Sunday at 10:30, in this past 9 years, church would start. Services would begin. And ready or not, come 10:30 Sunday morning, whatever was prepared for the service and for my message was what the people received. It wouldn't have been any good for me to show up at noon and say, finally, okay, I've got my message together now, just as everybody's exiting the door, or even much sooner than that in dismay. Well, like I said, I used to have a hard deadline every week, Sundays at 10:30, and I needed to be ready. Now I have a goal. I have a goal of getting these video messages out Thursdays at noon. But it's only a goal, isn't it? It's not a hard deadline. I suppose technically my deadline still is Sunday mornings. However, I know that some people watch my videos on Saturdays, or they may watch them as soon as they pop up on the Facebook feed or my email to you. So still trying to get it out by a goal, but it's a softer deadline for me. And I'm afraid it's now Friday night, and I'm just putting this video together now. Well, I've never been a person who worked very well by simply self-imposed deadlines. I've worked with real deadlines. Through 7 years worth of post-secondary education, I was only late perhaps 3 times on papers when they were due. I was early, probably never, but only late 3 times out of 7 years worth of papers, and a lot of papers that constituted. And I worked by real deadlines. That's how I'm wired. It took me quite a few years even to get comfortable with that and how I prepare messages. I admire those who can prepare so far ahead. But I've realized that I use every available minute to try to put things together and improve what I have to offer. And so real deadlines are what matters most to me. Deadlines, we all have them. They are in every area of our life. Real deadlines. Tasks that need to be done by a certain time. That's how we use the word deadline. But did you know where that phrase, that expression originally came from? During the U.S. Civil War, there was a Confederate captain named Walter Bowie. May 10th, 1864, he wrote about their facility for prisoners at Andersonville, Georgia. Here's what he wrote. On the inside of the stockade, 20 feet from the wall, there is a deadline established, over which no prisoner is allowed to go, day or night, under penalty of being shot. Now that is a deadline, a line which you dare not cross at penalty of being shot. Life has a deadline. Life has a deadline, but it is not marked out visibly, such as in that prison stockade. James, a half-brother to Jesus, son of Mary too, became a fully committed follower of Jesus as the Messiah after Jesus demonstrated that he was alive from the dead to him. He wrote a letter. In part of this letter, in James chapter 4, verse 14, he wrote this: "Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow, for you are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away." Life as we know it has a limit. Life has a deadline. And there is something here in what James wrote for each of us to examine. New Living Translation puts it this way: how do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while and then it's gone. We live in the Columbia Valley. Audrey and I live near the river itself, and through much of the winter, when I wake up in the mornings, the valley is covered with fog all the way through. And we can't even see that we're living in mountains. We can't see whether the sky is blue or the sky is cloudy until the sun comes and the fog lifts or burns off. That's the very picture that James has presented for us. In spring, the snow lingers so much longer on the higher altitudes where I wish I were living in winter so that I could be above the fog. But come spring and summer, I'm happy to be down in the lower elevations because the snow is gone sooner. Now this illustration that James uses, fog that lifts, the vapor that soon dissipates, it's a very easy to understand illustration. And it isn't original with James. He was simply a good student of the Bible and a good student of life, as we all should be. He had heard Job being read in Torah school. He had read and heard the Psalms written by David, the Psalms written by Asaph. And here is some of what they have to say. Listen.
Remember that my life is a mere breath. I waste away, I will not live forever. Leave me alone, for my days are only a breath. Behold, you have made my days like hand-widths, and my lifetime as nothing in your sight. Certainly all mankind standing is a mere breath. The Lord remembered that they were only flesh, a wind that passes and does not return. Man is like the breath. His days are like a passing shadow. Here is the whole passage from the letter written by James, the brother of Jesus, a disciple. James 4, 13-16 from the New Living Translation. Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town and will stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Otherwise you are boasting about your own pretentious plans, and all such boasting is evil.
If there is one thing this COVID pandemic has taught us, it should be this: we weren't ready. We just weren't ready. There was no business that had a 5-year plan which included time out for COVID. There was no church either with that in their plans. No wonder they say that if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Some first century Christians were apparently quite well off businessmen, or at least if they weren't well off yet, they were very ambitious and on their way to becoming well off. Men who were going somewhere, literally, because the Roman Empire was a place with roads and you could travel, and people traveled throughout the empire, and businessmen were not least among the travelers in the first century. James asks Christian businessmen to pay careful attention to what he has to say. He reviews their strategies in the text. Select a city, Create a time frame, a year or so. Develop a plan of action once you're on location. Clarify the goal, which is obvious, make money. So the businessmen felt they had covered their bases. They had a surefire plan for success. Don't believe it. James points out the problem. They had left God out of their calculations. According to James, God had no place in their plans. He just had no place in their plans. They failed to include him in the process. And they had no room for any unforeseen adverse circumstances in their projections. They exhibit a typical businessman's confidence in their own ability to carry out their plans to completion. You know a few people like that. I know some people like that. Do you know what's sad about this warning that James writes? The people that he is warning are people who are in the church. He's not talking to outsiders. He's not talking to people who give no time for God. He's talking to Christians, people within the church. He's saying, you're deluded. You are presumptuous. He was compelled to point out the weakness in their plans. For they make all these plans for next year, but they don't even know what will happen tomorrow. They plan as they know what the future holds, as though they control the future with all of their circumstances. You know what words describe that approach to life? Foolish, presumptuous, overconfident, arrogant, short-sighted. Those who pride themselves on their long-term plans. Their knowledge, limited. Circumstances, beyond their control. Their very lives and health, uncertain. Who knows if they'll be alive a year from now? Or tomorrow? Who knows? The folly of such planning is the underlying assumption the person makes. They're assuming, in effect, they will be around forever. Or at least for another year or two. You know, every time I stand at a graveside, I'm reminded of the brevity of life, the uncertainty of our days. We need to take it to heart. Life is like a vapor, a wisp, a fog that's burnt off by the morning sun, and it's gone. Every time we receive news that another acquaintance or relative has passed away, the message comes through. And none of us are immune from the terminal illness that we have. The terminal illness called life. Because nobody gets out of it alive. Except those who may be alive when Jesus returns. But that's a story for another day. I prefer to have this reminder written from James through his words, rather than to have another friend pass away, to realize the brevity of life and how I need to use my days for God. Now, what's the changes that James counsels? What does he instruct them, and what does he instruct us to do with all of our plans? Well, he wants us to go through to a change in our mental posture, in how we think, to then reorient our life. So that we intentionally acknowledge the one who does hold the details of our lives in his hands. God holds us in his hands. He does. God, the Bible says, knows the end from the beginning. God is trustworthy. We can entrust our lives to him. And that's the starting point to lay any foundation for a life and for a plan. To know God. And such an awareness prompts us to order our affairs differently, to reorder our affairs, to reorder our lives, conscious of God's presence, conscious of his prior claim on us. A person diagnosed with a terminal illness often begins to put their house in order. That phrase actually occurs in the Bible first, that I've run across it. And we need to be starting to thinking about putting our spiritual house in order. The change that James prescribes is a change from prideful self-indulgence and self-sufficiency to a willingness to bow our heart and our minds in humility before the Lord. Change from self-sufficiency to humility before the Lord. Question: am I willing to acknowledge that God is God and I am not? Am I willing to then order my affairs along the lines that please Him? Am I willing or not? As I said, James doesn't present a complicated picture. It's not a complicated vision. He offers just one phrase to be meaningfully attached to all of our human planning. If the Lord wants us to, New Living Translation puts it. Or, if the Lord wills, we will do this or we will do that. In the New Testament, discerning God's will is the same as learning the things which please Him. You are doing God's will when you are doing things that please Him. You are doing God's will when you are living in a way that brings delight to your God. That's doing God's will. Learning the things which please our God. To bring Him pleasure. It's a more antiquated English phrase, isn't it? To ask, what is your good pleasure? But that is exactly what the believer asks of God daily. Lord, what is your good pleasure? Lord willing, we will do this, we will do that. I've adopted that expression, Lord willing. You may have heard me use it. You may have heard me use it one time too many. But it's a reminder for me of how all my commitments are conditional. All my promises, all my commitments are conditional on God being willing to see them through. Like I said, it can be tiresome to hear somebody continually repeat that phrase after everything they say, Lord willing. And it isn't necessary to arbitrarily just repeat it continuously every time we make a statement or declaration of what we want to do. In fact, it can become so easily then just so much more meaningless repetition that Jesus warned us against in the Sermon on the Mount. It's using the words thoughtlessly. No, the Bible never instructs us to recite things thoughtlessly. It instructs us to embrace God with our whole mind, with all our heart, with all that we do, with all our strength, with our life. So we don't need to continually repeat the phrase, but some repetition is actually helpful. Periodically adding it to our actual conversation won't hurt. And if we don't say it right out loud, at least we need to keep it in mind. It's an attachment to every statement we make, Lord willing. It serves as an interesting check on our plans if for just a while, when declaring what we intend to do and expect to accomplish, that we actually say the words right out loud, if the Lord is willing. It's a helpful check on our plans. We need to live as though we believe it to be true also. All our planning, all our looked for outcomes are conditional on God permitting us to carry them out. Our very lives are conditional. Conditional on God's extended mercy and long-suffering patience. We live conditionally, dependent on the Lord being willing to have us continue living in this world. It is His will that matters. Now, planning is good. God ordains men and women to make plans. Planning is good. God created us in His image. And don't think that He imagined the whole universe without giving some thought and consideration to how things should fit together, The universe displays an incredible intelligent design. God's plan. Planning is good. The universe, as God made it, he said it was very good. It was good. Planning is good. It's plain folly, however, for us to make our plans without acknowledging God's will and how that affects the outcomes. Now, James addressed the traveling businessmen in the church. But you know these words aren't just for businessmen or businesswomen. They do provide an easy to understand illustration of how we all may fail to take God into account in our planning, in the way we live and plan our lives. An easy to understand illustration of how we all may fail to take God into account in the way we live and plan our lives. No one can work in a field without a plan or a garden. Feeding a family requires planning. Building and maintaining a home requires planning. Gaining a successful education requires planning and follow-through. Finding a new pastor for our church requires planning. A process, a strategy to move us into the future together. It's a God-ordained thing. Yet even there, we could leave God out of the process and follow mere human conventions. In fact, God has almost made it too easy for us to leave him out of the equation. How can we tell if we are leaving God out of our calculations? Well, two things come to my mind. First, how much are we praying about our plans? Do you care about your church? Rocky Mountain Alliance Church in Golden, BC, do you care about the church? Do you care about the people of this church? Do you care about the community that we're one of other churches that name Jesus as Lord? We're commissioned by Jesus to reach. Do you care about your church? How much are you praying about our plans for our next leader, our next pastor? How much are we praying about our plans? One clue to how much God enters into our calculations. Second consideration. How do you respond when things don't go according to your plan? How do you respond when things don't go according to your plan? You know what? It's quite easy to tell when someone else seems to be forgetting God in his calculations and their plans aren't going according to their hopes and expectations. Sometimes it's just so easy to see. James tells us the contrasting behavior is revealed in a person's boasting. It's when the plans are succeeding that you can even tell God was not accessed in making those plans. Boasting, he says, bragging, he said, when the person says, this is what I'm going to do, I've done it before, just watch me, it's going to happen again, we can do this. He might imply so clever, so calculating, so sure of himself, so certain he's covered his bases. Well then, who needs God? Did you hear how James judges such an attitude of boasting? Such boasting, James writes, is evil. It's not just a mere bad idea or poor sportsmanship. He says it's evil. Bragging about our own ingenuity and accomplishments and plans not only lacks the quality of good in God's eyes, but is actually something wicked. There is an acceptable boast in the Bible. You know that is the acceptable boast, according to Jeremiah and affirmed in the New Testament by Paul. The acceptable boast for the Christian is to boast in the Lord. That's the acceptable boast. But that's not typical. That's not usual. Well, James in his letters pointed out to them and to us what is the problem and the pitfall, so that we have no excuse any longer for leaving God out of our equations. No longer can we live unaware that there is a God to whom we will give account and who is master of everything. There was a wise man who wrote Proverbs. Solomon, it's attributed to King Solomon. And James was well acquainted with that book as well. Listen to these verses from Proverbs.
From Proverbs 16, 1-3 and 8-9. The plans of the heart belong to a person, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. All the ways of a person are clean in his own sight, but the Lord examines the motives. Commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Better is a little with righteousness than great income with injustice. The mind of a person plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps.
If 2020 and beyond is teaching us anything, it should be how flimsy our grasp of normal life is. How foolish it is for us to assume we have control. One reason I appreciate living in a smaller community is that we don't have any parking meters. I don't know what you thought I might say, but we don't have any parking meters, and I appreciate that. In the cities, I've walked by these small silver posts, and car after car, or space sometimes, and one after another may have sign posted on the little meter, time expired. Time expired. I see that message on a parking meter, and the first thing I think of, I hope I've plugged my meter with enough money for the time that I plan to be away. That's one thing. I really don't relish the thought of going back to my car and finding a little slip of paper under my windshield wiper and that little silver parking meter with the sign popped up, time expired. Not that it's ever happened that I can recall just offhand. So I see that message, time expired. A second thought's crossed my mind, however. I see it as a tract for our times. On reflection, I read a warning and a call to lift up my eyes, to look beyond the visible horizon. I read time expired and I think of eternity. Life as I know it has a limit. There is a deadline, invisible to me, but absolutely real, coming up. And there is an absolutely real reality beyond the visible horizon. The writer of Ecclesiastes asks some penetrating questions. Again, this may have been King Solomon. Listen.
Ecclesiastes 6:12. For who knows what is good for a person during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile life? He will spend them like a shadow. For who can tell a person what will happen after him under the sun?
The horizon of our vision, under the sun. That theme, that phrase pops up continually throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, under the sun. It means that if all there is to reality and all there is to life is what exists between sunup and sundown, or what is visible to our naked eye, if that's all there is, the writer concludes, then there is no hope. Then it does not matter how you live. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. It comes out of Ecclesiastes. However, that visible horizon is not the end of reality. Ecclesiastes pushes the boundaries in a couple key places, pointing towards the God who exists above all and to whom we are of obligations. And it is faith in God that opens up a vista, that there is life beyond the visible horizon. Jesus confirmed this through dying and rising from the dead, showing himself alive through many proofs to James, among others. There is a reality beyond the grave. There is a reality beyond the horizon that we see when we look out. This same Jesus, who demonstrated the reality beyond the visible horizon, was the one who prayed to his Father in the garden just before he was to be arrested and would be put to death. He prayed this: "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Not my will, but yours be done." So, make your plans. And say right out loud, "If this pleases you, Lord, here's what I want to do." Say right out loud, as you make your statement of what you plan, "Lord willing, this is what we shall do." Lord willing, we will one day meet again. Amen.